My name is Catherine Stoner. For those of you who I don't know, I am a senior fellow here and I'm a political scientist and I work on Russia. I'm also the deputy director of the Friedman Spogli Institute, and you're sitting in the Friedman Spogli Institute right now. CSAC is one of our constituent centers. We have 6 of them. It's my pleasure to welcome you to really our first event in our new program, Russia's Power and Purpose in the 21st Century, RPP 21, is that what we decided it is? RPP 21, which is a new program here that Michael McFall and I and research scholar Alice Underwood have at CSAC. So thank you, CSAC, for housing us. And Brian Taylor is actually our first real speaker in our program in terms of being a scholar of Russia. So we're particularly pleased to have him. Our next speaker in this series will be Gulnaz Sherifudinova on Friday, November 22nd. She's actually speaking at 1:30, so no free lunch on that one, everyone. You'll have to eat first. I'll tell you just a very, very little bit about the program first, which is really looking at what Russia is in the 21st century, what power it has, and what it wants to do with what it has. And so necessarily this will require us to determine what we mean by power, and also to look at what the Putin regime is. And so we could think of no better speaker. If we could not have Putin himself, and trust me, we could not, especially with Michael, I guess. Anyway, another story. We would have someone who wrote an absolutely excellent book that has just come out in the last year on Putin, Putinism, and US-Russia relations. The book is called The Code of Putinism, and after this talk, you should run, not walk, over to the bookstore and get it. It came out with Oxford in 2018. So it's my pleasure, as I said, to finally introduce Brian Taylor, who has come all the way from Syracuse, New York, which requires a number of connections, I think, who is professor of political science and chair of the political science department at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Brian's one of these people, I feel like I've known you all my life, almost. I barely remember a time not knowing you, Brian. We were at graduate school at roughly the same time. He has a PhD in political science from MIT. He works on, obviously, Russian politics and comparative politics more generally, along with this book, The Code of Putinism, which he'll talk about for us today. He has also written State Building in Putin's Russia, which is another great book on policing and coercion after communism. And he wrote also an excellent book in 2003 on politics in the Russian army, civil-military relations. Ever wondered why the Russians have never had a coup? Go get that book too. He also works on different aspects of Russian politics, including the intelligence services. Not a lot of people do that. And also on the Russian state. So Brian, I will stop talking now and let you take over. I mean, I will also apologize to the audience because I teach at 1:30. So I will gracefully and probably invisibly slip out of the room at about 1:14. And I will allow Alice Underwood, our excellent research scholar who is helping us run this project, a recent PhD here at Stanford, take over the Q&A. So thank you very much, Brian, for coming.
Thanks, Catherine, for that very nice introduction. Thanks, Alice Underwood, for all your help with the trip. And thank Mike McFall also for asking me to come speak at the beginning of this series on Russian power and purpose. So I'm going to frame this in terms of power and purpose, but also tying into, as Catherine noted, my book that came out last year on the Code of Putinism. And I thank everyone for coming. In Syracuse, when this many people come out on a beautiful day like this, we say, thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day, but I gather the weather's like this every day, so it wasn't as big of a sacrifice as if we were in Syracuse. So, as you all know, and probably one of the things that brings you here today, relations between the United States and Russia are not perhaps as good as some of us might have liked or imagined when the Cold War was winding down a couple of decades ago. And we now have people talking about how we're in a new Cold War with Russia and books coming out about that very topic. I gather if you're in Palo Alto, you're not supposed to call it a new Cold War. You're supposed to call it a hot peace.
That's exactly right.
Oh, wow, there he is.
Glad you got the note.
That was not planned, by the way. Just fortuitous. And I'm also not BSing, if I can use that term, when I say I actually don't like the term new Cold War, and I think hot peace is better. But if you like, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But one thing I can say, and because Catherine and I were in grad school at the same time and finishing at roughly the same time, we love President Putin because of what he's done for our careers. When I finished my dissertation 21 years ago now, this cartoon was in the New Yorker that month, and I thought that was my future, but I was fortunate enough to land an academic job and stay in academia and actually have people interested in hearing about what I'm doing, which I wouldn't have necessarily expected at some earlier periods. So why are we in bad relations with Russia today? As the series frames it, is this about power? And there are people who will tell you, especially people who self-identify as what international relations scholars like to call realists, that this is all about power and Russian power is resurgent, and therefore that is why US-Russian relations are in a difficult time. The flip side of that, or maybe an alternative view, is it's not so much about Russian power as about Russian purpose, which has to do with the agenda that the Russian leadership has set for itself. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about both those things, and I'm going to largely leave out, although I think this will come up in Q&A, the US side of things. So I want to start with a caveat and say, I'm not saying here that the US didn't do anything wrong after 1991. The US did plenty wrong. I'm happy to talk about it. But my focus today is on the Russia side of the US-Russia equation. And when I think about purpose, I guess this is perhaps a bit self-referential, but it made me think about the book I wrote about this last year, The Code of Putinism. For those old-time Sovietologists, you might remember there was a book that came out in 1953 called The Operational Code of Bolshevism. And so I stole the term code, although not the methodology, from that book. But when I'm talking about a code, I'm really talking about what I also refer to as the mentality of Team Putin. So now I'm going to have a thimbleful of digression into social science theory. So what do I mean by code or mentality? The dominant way that most social scientists, at least political scientists and economists, like to think about leaders and states is that these are rational actors that instrumentally pursue their self-interest, defined as power or resources, or however you want to define what it is that people want. But they're rational power and interest seekers. I don't agree with that way of thinking about people or about leaders, or in this case, about states. I think humans are a bit more complicated than that. And so I draw my inspiration from the German sociologist Max Weber, who in his book, Economy and Society, he set out 4 basic motives for human action. The first of which is instrumental rationality. So I'm not saying instrumental rationality is not part of the story, but what I call the coder mentality are the 3 other things that Weber talked about. First, he talked about ideas. He called it value rationality. He didn't call it, he distinguished that from instrumental rationality, but a set of ideas or values that one pursues. Another thing that he talked about as important, it was what he called habit or tradition. So these are things that you do without really being too conscious about what it is you're doing. They're natural responses because of how you grew up to lived experience. And the 4th thing he talks about, he called affect, or which we might think of as emotions or feelings. And I find this a more satisfying way of thinking about why humans do what they do, that yes, we're driven by our interests, but we're also driven by a set of ideas, a set of habits and emotions. And so what I try and do in the book, based on spending a lot of time reading what Putin says and the people around him say, and talking to a lot of people in Moscow and in the United States about what drives this guy, and reading books like Mike's book, trying to understand what it is that's driving Team Putin. And this is what I think of as the nervous system that sort of controls the body politic of Russian politics. And when we think about Russian foreign policy, I think this mentality or code leads to a strategy that link up to the purpose part of the story as we go through the talk. So as we go through this, first I want to talk about how do we weigh Russia. And by weighing Russia, I just mean an assessment of Russian power. So that's the power side of the equation. Then I want to talk about the code in more detail. So this is the purpose side of the equation. And I'm going to argue that it's the combination of Russian power plus this code of Team Putin that leads to this punching above its weight strategy. So that's where we're going over the next half hour or so. So first of all, how do we weigh Russia in terms of assessing its power? And the story I'm going to tell is one about relative weakness. And the word relative is italicized because it's really important to bear in mind. We're talking about relative to a set of measures. The first is the obvious one, relative to the Soviet Union. Very briefly, but obviously spend the whole talk just talking about power, but I really want to get to the purpose side. I'm going to talk briefly about some demographic, economic, and political weaknesses that I think make Russia somewhat limited in its foreign policy strategy. Although, on the other hand, we obviously have to acknowledge that Russia today is much stronger than it was in the 1990s, coming out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So first of all, before getting to weaknesses, I want to talk a bit about Russian strengths. Obviously, Russia is the biggest country in the world. Even though when the Soviet Union collapsed, it lost more territory than the size of the entire EU. That's how much territory was lost. Of the other 14 republics, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's still by far the biggest country in the world. Borders on Europe, borders on Asia. Well, it's in Europe and Asia both, close to the Middle East. So it obviously has that. It's a P5 member of the Security Council. It's one of the two nuclear superpowers along with the United States. The arsenals are much bigger than those of China or other countries. Obviously, everyone knows that Russia is a major world exporter of oil and gas, about 12% now of world oil production and 17% of world gas production. And Russia has a rich history and culture, which I think also gives it some power and status internationally. And just as an aside here, I want to say that I think one unfortunate consequence of the current state of U.S.-Russian relations, and especially a lot of the political turmoil in Washington around this, is we sometimes forget when we talk about Russian politics that the Russian people are a different part of this story, and they have a rich culture and tradition that they can and should be proud of. And I don't see Russians as the enemy here. And I think we should bear that in mind, that when we talk about U.S.-Russian relations, we're not talking about the population as a whole. I'm talking about the leadership primarily in this talk. So those are some strengths. But I think if we step back and have a longer perspective on things, we can see important ways in which Russia is very weak. So this is a graph that I put together with one of my research assistants, where we look at Russia as a percentage of global population and as a percentage of the global economy. And from 1700 to 1917, we're talking about the Russian Empire, and then we're talking about the Soviet Union to 1991, and then after that, the Russian Federation. So if we go all the way back to the time of Peter the Great, Russia was about 4% of the world economy and about 4% of the world population. Steady increase through the 18th and 19th centuries into the 20th centuries, and Russia in this sense kind of peaked in the 20th century, where it grew to be about 8% of world population and about 10% at its peak of the global economy. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia became almost overnight really much weaker in these material terms, in terms of demography and in terms of the size of its economy, falling to about 2.5% of world total in those two categories. And then it's generally declined since then, despite the economic recovery in the 2000s, to where it's less than 2% of world population and 2% of world GDP. Now, the other big story of the last 40 years, besides Russian decline, and I will say if we look at this figure, we can understand why Vladimir Putin considers the collapse of the Soviet Union one of the biggest geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. And I think it's worth emphasizing that word geopolitical. The collapse had a huge impact on Russian power in the world. So the other big story of the last 40 years is the rise of China. So if we compare these two countries just in terms of the size of their economy, we can see a steady Russian rise up to the 1970s, 1980s or so, a long period of Chinese decline relative to the rest of the world, and then a complete reversal of fortune over the last 40 years, which is a key driver, I think, of international politics today. So Russia militarily is quite strong in the world, but if we look at just military spending, it still lags far behind the United States or China. So this is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The US and China combined make up about half of all world military spending. They have Russia in, what is that, 6th place? I think that's probably not quite accurate because this is just a strict ruble to dollar conversion. And if we think about how you produce military power, Russia can generate more military power with its rubles than this comparison would tell you. But I still think it's fair to think of Russia as the third biggest military power in the world, following behind after the United States and China. So there are obvious weaknesses that Russia confronts simply because of the basic drivers of economics and demography. It's been fairly efficient about converting this into military power recently, but it's still lagging quite a bit behind the United States and China. So now I want to switch to talking about the purpose side of the story. And I want to say at the beginning that I think about this as a coder mentality, and I don't think of it as an ideology in the sense that Marxism-Leninism was an ideology. So I think of an ideology as being a coherent, all-encompassing, universalist way of thinking about the world that really has had a lot of thought and effort put into hammering out the details of it. So those of us who have studied Russian history, we know that Lenin and his comrades and other Marxists in the early 20th century spent a lot of time arguing about what was the proper relationship between the workers and the peasants. This was a big thing that they used to argue about, and they used to write books and books about it. Vladimir Putin is not interested in ideology the way Vladimir Lenin was interested in ideology, right? I don't think he thinks about that much, but he has ideas, okay? So it's not an ideology, but there are some ideas that are part of this code. And there has been some effort recently, I would say in the past couple of decades, to sort of elevate sort of Putin inside the Russian political discourse to a kind of cult of personality figure. So sometimes people think of him as the center of the solar system. I love this photo. It looks like the sun is chairing a meeting of the Russian National Security Council rather than Vladimir Putin, some kind of deity there. Or this one, someone turned him into some kind of saint. I think Russian photographers are having fun with this sort of this game. But so he's not a god, he's not a saint. He is a political figure that has certain ideas, but he's not the centerpiece of some state-dominant ideology. So what exactly is in the code, the way I think of it? And I want to get at this by giving you an excerpt, pretty long excerpt, as you can see, from an answer he gave to a reporter at a press conference in December 2014. So Putin does these marathon press conferences where he answers questions for 3 hours, sometimes longer. And just to remind you where we were in December 2014, this is after the annexation of Crimea, after the Russian incursion into Ukraine that starts the war there, after the shooting down of the MH17, after the imposition of sanctions by the United States and the EU and other countries. And in November and December 2014, the Russian ruble fell by half in the space of about 2 to 3 weeks. And so a reporter at this press conference asked him, she said, is this economic trouble we're having now some kind of payback for what we did in Crimea and Ukraine? And this is how he responded. Sometimes I think to myself, perhaps our bear should just sit quietly, stop chasing piglets around the taiga and feed upon bears and honey. Maybe they would leave him alone. No, they won't, because they will always try to put him in chains. And as soon as they chain him, they will rip out his teeth and claws. In today's understanding, that would mean our nuclear deterrent forces. And then he goes on. And then after they've ripped out its claws and teeth, the bear won't be needed at all. They'll turn it into a scarecrow, and that will be it. Therefore, it has nothing to do with Crimea. It has to do with the fact that we are defending our independence, our sovereignty, and our right to exist. We want to survive and fight, or we want our skin to hang on a wall. That is the choice we face. So I want to point to several things that are part of what I consider the code. And in the book, I talk about 10, 12 things that I consider part of it. Some of them ideas, some of them emotions, some of them habits. So in the realm of ideas, You can see a suspiciousness of the West, and I would say even some anti-Americanism in there. We can talk about that in the Q&A. I think there are other examples of that in Putin's discourse over the years. But this notion that the US wants to take away its nuclear weapons and weaken Russia, we've heard from Putin and people around him many times. This feeling of vulnerability, this sense that Russia would just like to be left alone, but they keep coming to try and threaten us. Packaged with that is some resentfulness about what has happened after the end of the Cold War, a feeling that Russia was not treated with respect, in fact, was disrespected by the US and other Western powers, and therefore its interests were not taken into account. Something I think of in terms of habit is a real primacy that Putin puts on order and unity. So he has this discussion where people who disagree with his way of thinking about Russian behavior are those who want its skin to hang on a wall. Right? It's a very black and white kind of way of thinking about things. And then I think the core idea, if there is one, in his system of thought is that he's a statist. And in Russian, this is two different words. We only have one for it really in English, but one part is about being strong internally in terms of the power of the state vis-a-vis society. And the other is about being a great power externally. And in 2003, in his State of the Union speech, Putin made this very explicit. He said, every time historically when Russia was weak internationally, it also faced the prospect of dismemberment and collapse. So he sees these two things as very closely bound together, and you need to restore the power of the state internally and externally for Russia to survive and go forward. The Russian journalist Andrei Soldatov remarked a couple of years ago, it's an emotional story of Russia not being treated like a superpower, and for many of them, it's a personal story. And there are two things I like about this quote. One, it's emotional. It's not just about interest rationally conceived, but also it's a personal story for Putin and many of the people around him who made their careers in the 70s and 80s in the Soviet Union and saw everything change when the Soviet Union collapsed. So before going on, I do want to make clear that saying he has a code or saying there's a mentality of Team Putin is not meant to demonize Putin. It's meant to try and understand him. And sometimes in the discourse about Putin in the West, you see him portrayed as this kind of evil mastermind genius kind of figure. A Russian journalist, Mikhail Zygar, said he's often portrayed as a kind of Bond villain, and Putin likes that. Zygar asserted that Putin likes being thought of that way. It makes him feel good that the West sort of sees him that way. But when I think about that, I actually think of a quote from Nathan Fillion that he attributes to Joss Whedon. So for anyone in the room who doesn't know who Joss Whedon is, he's a director, writer. He created the greatest TV show of all time, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He directed the first two Avengers movies. And the bad guy in the last season of Buffy was this actor named Nathan Fillion. And he was talking to Josh about how to play the character. And Whedon said to him, bad guys don't think they're the bad guys. They think they're the heroes. And I think definitely that is how Putin sees himself. He's not the Bond villain, right? He is not Ernst Blofeld from the Bond movies. He's Bond himself. He's the good guy. And I found this photo, or I found this poster when I was walking around Moscow 8 years ago, I think, where someone had photoshopped Putin's head onto the most recent James Bond film. I think it was Casino Royale. And if you look at the text, for those who read Russian, it basically says, Putin is covering you, or Putin has sort of got your back. He's watching out for you, kind of thing. And I think that's how he sees things. And I think he feels, not just thinks, but feels that he's playing defense, that he's not on the offense here, that he's playing defense because of threats that Russia is experiencing from the outside. Now, we don't have time, to go into every different thing that's happened over the last 20 years in US-Russian relations in the talk. I'll just throw a few images up there about some sore points in the relationship. NATO enlargement has been a constant source of complaint from the Russians for a long time. The 2003 Iraq War, you may recall that Putin, along with French President Jacques Chirac and German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, opposed that war, as did many of us in the room, I suspect. That was a sore point. The events in Ukraine, and this is an image after the shooting down of the MH17 plane, has obviously been a sore point more recently. And then the Russian relationship with Syria and the whole conflict around Syria. All of these things have been important flashpoints in US-Russian relations, and I certainly would not say the US is blameless in some of these, and in some of these I actually agree with Putin in some of his critiques of US policy, which we can talk about. But if I want to think about what's really at the core of the dispute now, I actually don't think it's all of these international issues. I think it's the way that Putin thinks about how the West behaves vis-a-vis internal Russian politics. And the real sore point we might think of as that between democracy promotion versus colored revolution. So the United States for a long time, yes, sometimes hypocritically, has made democracy promotion an important part of its foreign policy. And in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, this meant things like supporting civil society, supporting free and fair elections, supporting the rule of law, economic assistance, a whole series of things that were designed to help Russia become a democracy. At least that's how it was conceived in terms of US policy. So here you can see an image of vote observers, electoral observers. There's a Russian organization named Golos that observes all the elections and reports on whether they were free and fair. And in 2011, in December of 2011, Russia had a parliamentary election in which very good evidence came out that the results were not free and fair, and tens of thousands of Russians went out into the streets to protest. At that time, Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, came public and said, the United States does not believe these elections were free and fair, which they were not. I think that's a matter of fact. I don't think that's a matter of interpretation. And Putin responded to that by saying opposition leaders in Russia heard the signal and with the support of the US State Department began active work. So these tens of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow are not there because they want free and fair elections. They're there because the United States manipulates them and encourages them to go out and protest. And I think if we look at the Russian interference in 2016, at least some of it can be traced to Putin's dislike of Clinton because of that statement, his feelings about US behavior, and his feeling that it was now time to strike back against this American interference in Russian elections with some Russian interference in American elections. So this is the intelligence community report from January 2017 about Russian interference. For those of you who've read the report, it's actually not very good on the facts because there was so much they didn't feel like they could unclassify or declassify in that period of time. Since then, a lot of the stuff that was behind this report is now in the Mueller report. So especially if you look at volume 1 of the Mueller report, a lot of this material is in there, as well as his indictments of various Russian political actors. But I think in terms of interpretation, the report was actually pretty good. This January 2017 report, the intelligence community, and the way the New York Times summarized the gist of the report, Putin sees the election attack as payback, not offense, but defense. And the Russian political journalist Andrei Soldatov, who I referred to earlier, he thinks there was a specific moment when Putin specifically thought that he needed to respond, and this was the release of the Panama Papers. For those of you who don't recall, the Panama Papers was this investigative journalist inquiry into money laundering, and it got lots of people. If you look at the report, it's not really about Russia at all. It's about money laundering and offshore accounts held by lots of people from the United States, Great Britain, and Russia and other countries. But one of the people that figured in the Panama Papers happens to be someone who's very close to Vladimir Putin, a cello player, as it happens to be, who seems to be worth $2 billion, and people wonder where that $2 billion came from. And so Putin thought the CIA was behind the Panama Papers. So Putin believed the Panama Papers attack was sponsored by Hillary Clinton's people, and this provided him with a justification for a retaliatory operation. Zooming out from just the 2016 electoral interference to think about the international order in general, I think it's fair to say, and Vladimir Putin has made this clear many times, that he thinks the post-Cold War order has been unfairly dominated by the United States as a hegemon, and he wants to rewrite the international rules of the system, and in that sense, sort of return to a different way of doing business internationally. And he talks about this a lot. I'm guessing Mike McFall had to sit through some lectures in which Vladimir Putin talked about some of these things, about how Russia was treated unfairly, how the international order does not respect Russian interests, and how it needs to be revised. So this photo is from a G20 meeting, the one that took place in Brisbane, Australia. So this is right after MH17 was shot down over Ukraine. And Putin got a really hard time from a lot of Western leaders at this conference complaining about Russian behavior in Ukraine, so much so that he decided to leave the conference early. And his press secretary came out and said, well, it's a long flight and the president is really tired, so he wanted to get home. And I think we all know that if you're at a party and you're not having a good time, you say you're tired and you want to go home and, you know, make your apologies and leave. The other thing I like about this photo is Putin's kind of over in the corner. It's like one of those wedding photos when someone shows up with a new boyfriend or girlfriend and you put them on the side so you can Photoshop them out. I think Putin thinks he's going to be Photoshopped out of deciding the rules of the international system, and he wants to be a key participant. And here's another quote from this Russian journalist I've already referred to, Mikhail Zygar. His book, by the way, called All the Kremlin's Men, I think it's the title in English, is really quite good. He thinks the new globalization is just a fig leaf for what's really going on, which is that Western leaders want to divide up the world without him and leave Russia without a slice. All right, so what would a new world order in Vladimir Putin's terms mean? This, by the way, is my favorite photo of Vladimir Putin. I think it should be everyone's favorite photo of Vladimir Putin. It's such a favorite photo of mine that a couple of years ago, well, actually, it would have been about a year ago, actually, I saw on Twitter is useful for some things, a post of a Vladimir Putin holiday sweater with a version of this image on it. And my wife and I are not very sentimental about holidays. My wife, by the way, was an undergrad at Stanford and a fellow at CSAC, but we're not very sentimental about them, but I sent her a link to this because I found it on Amazon. And I said, this is what I want for Christmas. And Christmas came and went, and there was no sweater. And I was kind of annoyed. And I said to my wife, I said, well, where's the sweater? She said, I thought you were kidding. And I said, no, I wasn't kidding. I want this sweater. So this is what the sweater looks like. He's on a reindeer in Santa gear, but otherwise it's pretty much the same Putin that we know and love. All right, so she came through. All right, so what would a new world order look like according to Vladimir Putin? I think he's been fairly clear about what he expects. In 2015, when he was giving his speech to the UN, he spent the beginning part of the speech talking about the great achievement after Yalta and the big three. And I think he envisions a world order in which the major powers, and he considers Russia one of those major powers, is going to define how the international order works and make decisions over the heads of other states in the world about international order. And the big three for him are the US, China, and Russia. And various international relations analysts in Moscow that are close to the Kremlin have talked about this quite openly, about we need a new big three involving these three countries. And if we think back to my discussion of Russian power earlier, this is one reason I think that Russia might be punching a bit above its weight. In some ways, it may be part of this big three. Certainly in the nuclear realm it is, certainly in other realms it is. But in other ways, we can think compared to the United States and China, it's somewhat punching above its weight. If we look at the size of its population and where that's going over the next 50, 100 years, if we look at the size of the economy and where that's expected to go, you'll remember I said earlier that Russia is now less than 2% of world GDP. To put that in other terms, the size of the Russian economy, if we just do a strict ruble to dollar conversion, is the size of the economy of the state of New York. And the size of the California economy is almost twice as big as the size of the Russian economy. So compared to China in the US, Russia is lagging in that key driver of power. And to a certain extent, I would characterize that as a bit of overambition on Russian part. And I think that overambition is a product of the code. So circling back to the theme of this seminar series, if I had to choose between purpose and power, and I think both are important, but I think what's driving Russian foreign policy and US-Russian relations from the Russian side is this mentality or code that I talked about, which leads to a certain set of Russian behaviors in the international system. So, thank you. And I think I'm supposed to sit here for Q&A.
Yes,
so.
yep. Just a reminder, I have to go teach, but I'm here for a while. So as a result of my being here, so one of the reasons we're doing this is purely selfish, Brian, in that I'm writing, as you know, a book on Russian power and purpose in the 21st century. I keep saying I'm finishing it, and I am. I really am, colleagues. This time I mean it. But So I look at power in a couple of different ways. And one is, taking on this realist conceptualization that it's men, military, and money. But then I also look at different dimensions of Russian power, like policy scope, right? And whether it's a weighty actor in some areas and not others, and geographic domain. So as I look at that, Russia doesn't look quite as bad as the realist version that you just did, the means of power, right? It's looking, over the weekend I was reading about where Russia is in Africa, and how it has how they have moved in as we've moved out in particular, and the policy areas where it tends to go in. And these are quite weighty ones in the world. And I think this is where it becomes a different actor internationally than China. So one is obviously energy, right? So it doesn't just seek to export or sell it abroad, but oil, for example, or liquefied natural gas, but also to control the transportation networks, right? So you showed quickly that. So that's a not fitting into the power, right? So when you talk about punching above its weight, one of my arguments is it's actually not as much of a bantam as people think it is, right? So anyway, the other thing is, I think, and that you didn't talk about, and I'd love for you to comment on, you do talk about the code, and obviously the book is all about the code. So could you talk to us a little bit more also about domestic politics and how domestic politics actually helps or hinders Russia's reemergence globally?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I'll keep a list, and if you could just put your hands up, and I will add you.
So several parts of your question, Catherine, that I want to address. The first is just this issue of thinking about how we define power. What are the elements of national power? Obviously, in a truncated version. Okay, sorry. I'm supposed to be mic'd. Maybe it's not
better.
close
That's
enough.
much
Is that
better.
better?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope you didn't miss the whole talk. So elements of national power, this is a truncated version. If we go through a series of comparisons in terms of economics, military power, even sort of the quality of governance, maybe soft power we could think of in terms of Russian sort of cultural influence internationally, I still think it's fair to say that Russia is very much weaker than it was, and still very weak compared to the United States, compared to the European Union, outside of the military domain, and compared to China. But you are right that because of its geographic scope and because of how it defines its interests globally, it can actually be an important player in certain parts of the world. Africa is an interesting example where Russia has been fairly active recently. There was this big Russia-Africa summit a couple of weeks ago. But if we look at what came out of that, Russian investment in Africa and African trade with Russia is still very limited compared to how much the US invests in trades in Africa, how much China does, how much various other actors like European countries, even Middle Eastern countries are putting into Africa. And if we break down the Russian trade with Africa, a lot of it has to do with North Africa, and it has to do with weapons sales. So I think it would be an overstatement to say that Russia is participating in affairs in Africa at the level the United States or China or Europe are, or at the level it did in the 1970s in the Soviet Union. So they're trying to do what they can, but they're doing it with less. And that's why they're doing things like promoting arms sales, using mercenaries and those kinds of things, which are a bit cheaper than some of their more ambitious efforts. The other part of the question was about the internal politics, and I think this is a really important issue that I didn't really address at all in the talk, so thank you for the opportunity. But another element, I think, of national power is the ability to translate leadership wishes into outputs, and I think if we look at how Russia is governed as a state, that they often fall short of the targets they set for themselves simply internally. If we look at the promises that were made 10, 12 years ago about what economic growth was going to be, about what they were going to do in healthcare, about what they were going to do in education, about what they were going to do in infrastructure, we often see that they fall short of what they say they're going to do, and they fall short compared to some countries that they would consider their peers. And we can set aside the United States, we can set aside some of the wealthier European countries like Germany or France and say, well, that's not a fair comparison because Russia's not as developed as them. But even if we compare the quality of governance to countries like China, India, Brazil, countries like the so-called BRIC countries, and we look at the efficiency of how they implement government decisions, if we look at the respect for the rule of law, if we look at corruption, in international indices of all these things, Russia falls behind all of those countries. And if we compare Russia not to the wealthiest countries in the world, but upper middle income countries, which is how the World Bank classifies them, we see the same thing, that Russia is actually underperforming relative to those countries. And the other thing that's worth noting is it actually hasn't changed that much under Putin. It's kind of surprising if you go back and look at the indicators. There was a period during his first term when people thought he was maybe going to get a handle on some of the corruption and rule of law issues and some of the problems with government efficiency. That seems to have not really been borne out in most sectors. And we still see Russia struggling to run the affairs of state in the way that they might need to if they want to compete as one of the leading global powers.
Okay, so I started the list. We'll have lots to talk about at dinner.
Yeah.
There's a lot I disagree with there. But anyway, let's talk about it. All right, I have Amir first. Just introduce yourself.
Amir Banga, of history here, of Russian history. And I wonder, I agree with every word that you said, but. No, but is in what way the... More than this? Okay. I wonder in what way the code, the Putinist code, deviates from basic patterns of Russian conduct throughout the centuries. Because even if we take into account the decline, and the decline is indisputable, nevertheless, everything that you described, we can take it to 1721, 1814, 1941, 1945, etc. So the numbers are a bit weaker, but punching above its weight, and constant compensation of aggression for economic weakness, etc. This is the basic pattern of Russian conduct in foreign policy. Why I'm asking this? Simply for American foreign policy makers and decision makers. Being fixated on the personality, which is very important, at the background of this person, but nevertheless trying to identify certain persistent codes that seem to elude policymakers who are bereft of knowledge of Russian history, but they are more fixed on the personality, etc.
So I'm sorry, I have to repeat the question because we're recording, I guess, and streaming it. So the question was by Amir Viner from Greece, and also a Russian historian here, asking in what ways does the code under Putin differ from the basic patterns of conduct of Russia historically? And our second subset of the question was the fixation on personality. Is that important in thinking about Russia?
That's a great question, and I think it's one of the best counter arguments to the argument of my book, basically. And I got this when I was discussing the book manuscript with some colleagues, and one of them said, this isn't Putinism, this is Russianism, basically, that this is a deep-seated pattern of Russian behavior that you shouldn't isolate to this elites. And I think there's something to that, but I don't think that's the entire story. And let me respond with two different versions of why that might not be entirely true. One is a basic conception of history, and I'm not inclined to see it as circular. I'm more inclined, for better or worse, to see it as a bit more linear. And I would point out that the world we live in the early 21st century is a slightly different world than the times that you mentioned, and that a Russia that is as developed as it is, because Russia is not a poor country, right? It's poor in terms of the size of its economy relative to the United States, but if we look at the standard of living of average Russians, it's actually above the world average, right? If we look at a population that's educated, urbanized, very literate, very professional in many important ways, and if we look at a country that now has nuclear weapons, if we look at an international system in which, for the most part, with some exceptions, including Crimea, parts of another country's territory are not taken off of them, and they're not wiped off the map, right? We live in a different international order for a variety of reasons than we did previously. So I don't think that world leaders should define their policy with reference to what Peter the Great or Catherine the Great or Joseph Stalin faced. Because I think Russia can make its way in the world without so much of an emphasis on military power, without so much of an emphasis on this trying to seek this sphere of influence the way that it does in the countries around them, that its interests can be protected using other means. Maybe that means I'm naive, but I think the world has moved on in some ways from where we were a century or even 50 years ago. So I think in that sense, there's a choice here that Russia makes. It's not simply preordained to follow these past patterns. And then my second response is more in terms of looking at the current period. If we look at what we have available to us in data from Russian public opinion polling, mass polling, and opinion polling done among the elites, we can see that the shift to a more kind of anti-Western worldview actually took place among the elites first. It took place in the late 1990s over a whole series of issues, including Kosovo, and that there's a good paper by Edward Panarin and a couple of other Russian scholars that look at this, where the masses kind of followed. So I think the change took place at the elite level first. So in that sense, this is not some reflection of Russian culture or Russian mass will. It's a product of elite thinking. It's broader than Putin, certainly. But I think that when Putin came to power and he started to control the messaging on television and brought a like-minded group of people around him, that the messaging shifted quite a bit from what we saw under Gorbachev or Yeltsin. And so counterfactually, if we had a different leader coming to power in 2000, we might have had a very different understanding of what Russian interests were and what its strategy should be in the world. So in that sense, I think looking at the leadership is still very important, and imagining a different alternative is out there as a possibility if we look at what happened at the time in Russian history.
All right, next on our list is Mike McFall. And again, unfortunately, I'll have to repeat the question into the mic.
Okay, thanks for being here, Brian. Mike McFall from Stanford. It's kind of a variation on Amir's question, and then a second question. I actually have 17 questions.
You're having dinner.
I'm only going to
Yes,
ask
right,
two
yes.
for right now, okay? So a couple of pieces on that. First, other empires have escaped this historical shadow, right? So why did Russia not escape it, right? Like that's a different way of asking the question. And related to that is what you just mentioned about the counterfactual about Putin. If there was a different leader, well, why wasn't there a different leader? And does that have to do with chance, or was he reflective of something deeper in society? Just, I want you to riff deeper on that, because I think it's actually the fundamental question. Yeah. And related to that, does that mean that Yeltsin and Gorbachev and even Medvedev, they were the aberration or not? And right. That piece. Yeah. The second question is about ideas versus ideology. And I've read your book. I know your argument, but I want to hear, under what conditions would you change your mind? You know, there's a lot of people that admire Putin. It's a set of ideas. There are people in America, there are people in Europe who look to it. Why isn't illiberalism an ideology? If liberalism is an ideology, why isn't the opposite of it an ideology? And what would, you know, would it morph into something else? I mean, I take your point about his background, and he wasn't studying ideologies and he doesn't talk in those terms, but why isn't illiberalism a transnational ideology that should be treated just like liberalism is? And he just happens, whether it's his own ideas or not is a different matter, right? Yeah. Whether we should call it Putinism. Right. So how would you change your mind about that? Okay. You know, what evidence would make you change your mind?
Sorry.
What changes?
And sorry, I need to repeat it. I know Renee's out there somewhere telling me to do it. So why did Russia not escape this historical shadow that and other countries have? Why not a different leader? Is Putinism a set of ideas or an ideology? And if liberalism is an ideology, why isn't the illiberalism that Putinism seems to be? Okay,
thanks, Mike. Two great questions. I'll take them in order. So why did Russia not escape this shadow the way you put it? And I think there is an element to which there were strong forces moving Russia in this direction. So I don't want to blunt the force of either question I got about this. And if we even rely on Yeltsin's memoirs, which he probably didn't write, but I think they reflect some things that he thought. There's this argument in there that Russian society was looking for a strong sort of military leader with he said something like a spine of steel or something. I forget the phrase he used, after the chaos and disorder of the 1990s. And I think we saw earlier periods in the 1990s with Zhirinovsky's performance in the December 1993 parliamentary elections, Alexander Lebed's performance in the 1996 presidential elections where he came third. This is a former military general who is making Putin-style arguments to a certain extent before Putin. There definitely was that thread. It was there among the elites. It was there among the masses, but I still think it was contingent. And in that sense, I think a lot depends on leadership. And in this case, it depends on Yeltsin's decision for a variety of reasons to back Putin as his successor. And we know other people were entertained for that position. And ultimately, he decided on Putin. I think he decided on Putin for reasons of personal self-interest because he believed that Putin had demonstrated in the past his loyalty to those people who were part of his team. Loyalty is another thing I talk about as one of the elements of the code. And I think that that is how Yeltsin and the people very close to him, that it was really a small group of people who decided that Putin should be promoted as the successor. It wasn't obvious it was going to work, but they decided he should be, was because they thought he would protect Yeltsin and his family from any political retribution if the election went the way they wanted it to, and that therefore those very personal interests would be protected. But if he had gone with someone else, whether it had been Boris Nemtsov, and we can talk about how realistic that was, or Sergei Stepashin, sorry for the name dropping for those of you who aren't like versed in all the details of 1990 Russian politics. Nemtsov was seen as a more kind of liberal, younger reformer type, and Sergei Stepashin was kind of in the middle. He had a police background, but he'd associated with one of the more liberal political parties. Nemtsov had been the deputy prime minister. Stepashin was prime minister for a while before Putin. So there were other people that were considered, or even if we imagine a situation in which Putin lost the election and Yevgeny Primakov became president, for example, I think you would see a shift, right? But I don't think we would see quite the level of feeling of disrespect, of the need to enact some sort of, I hate to use the word revenge, but that's the one that comes to mind, on what the West had done. I think Primakov or Stepashin, someone like that, Primakov was the former foreign minister who was the most likely alternative to win the election. They would have had a different view of Russian policy than perhaps we saw from Yeltsin in the early 1990s, but not leading to the sorts of policies like the annexation of Crimea. It's hard for me to imagine that other group of political actors taking that kind of step, because I don't think they would have looked at what happened in Kiev in late 2013 and 2014 and said, the Americans are behind everything that's happening there, which I think is the way Putin interpreted it. And the Americans are coming to take over Crimea and put US naval bases there if we don't act quickly. I don't think you would have seen that type of response. So that's my answer to the first question. I apologize, it was a bit long. The second part about the ideology part and what would make me change my mind. As an academic, I have to admit I would be willing to change my mind. Otherwise, I don't fit within the academic discourse.
Just don't run for political office.
My sense of him as this is about personality, and it's more kind of a gut thing. I don't see Putin, and I talked to a lot of people in Moscow about him, and people would say things like, Putin hates ideology, right? He has no interest in this kind of stuff. And they would attribute a lot of what was said on behalf of Putin or even by Putin as the work of the people around him who were writing his speeches and that kind of thing. And obviously there's a certain element of truth to that, but I do think he has ideas. And I do think illiberalism, as you referred to, is one of the ideas. You can call it conservatism or illiberalism, but he doesn't believe that it's right for Russia to have the kind of political system that emphasizes individual rights, self-determination, those kind of things. He thinks of a political order in which the state is dominant and society in some senses subordinate to state interest in terms of how it conducts its internal and external policy. So in that sense, there is a strong illiberal element there. but I see the transnational piece of the illiberalism as more kind of opportunistic than commitment to this ideology. They support illiberal forces in Europe because it weakens the EU and not because they think it's the ideology that's going to sweep the globe or anything like that. So although I think in terms of ideas, he's illiberal, I think in terms of how Russia presents itself to the world, that piece of it is much more a tool that they use than an ideology that they're promoting. Now, what would lead me to change that? I guess if it became more routinized in some way, where we see it becoming part of what the elite are propagating in a more sort of systemized kind of way, if they start intervening in various spheres that have been left removed from this, like academia or whatever, and forcing everyone to sort of parrot this idea, then I would say they've embraced this as a matter of policy that is going to sort of reshape Russia internally. I don't think they're there yet. So.
Okay, thanks. David Holloway.
David Holloway here at CSAC. I have two questions too, since the precedent has been set. So the first question is fairly narrow. You didn't, in talking about Putin, mention his KGB background. But nevertheless, when you answered Mike's question and talked about difference between, say, Putin and Primakov, the difference is one that you would associate with a kind of police organization, you know, seeing everything being manipulated from outside and so on. So my question is, how important is that both for him, but also how important is that for the Russian state that he has put together, since the security services have a big role? My second question has to do with your characterization of his view of world order. You mentioned, yes, great power, a world order dominated by great powers, and great powers have certain rights that smaller states don't have, by definition. But secondly, you also said he just wants a bigger slice of the world, and I think that's right. That it's not a different world order, it's just a world order in which Russia has a bigger role, but with one qualification, that their analysis of world order is a very cynical one, because they basically see the US and democratic states as hypocritical, as not operating according to the principles that we espouse. They may be, I'm not going to say that's totally wrong, but,
right.
but so that surely also is actually an important qualification, because what they're pointing to as the world order they want to be part of is not always the world order that we think is there, of our so-called rules-based world order.
Okay, so sorry, I have to repeat that. David Holloway from CSAC, Professor Emeritus of Political Science and History, asks first, you didn't mention the KGB background when you were talking about Putin, but clearly the difference between Putin and, say, Primakov, for example, right, right.
But not a
hey,
case.
right.
Who knows?
Okay, this is your question. Now he's, yeah, Primakov, who was also a KGB officer, may have acted differently. How important is it for Putin and for the Russian state that he has created, that is this KGB background? Second, you think David thinks you're accurate in your characterization of the world order as being one divided up among great powers. Great powers have certain rights that small states don't. Russia wants a bigger slice of the world. This is not David's view, by the way. This is Putin's view, that David thinks that, that you have accurately characterized. Just clarifying that. That Russia wants a bigger slice of the world order, but its analysis of the world order as it exists is really very cynical. It sees the United States and democracies in general acting hypocritically, not according to principles. So the world order that Russia sees or wants to be part of might be quite different from the one that currently exists. I feel kind of like a translator from English to
You're doing beautifully. Your English-English translation is perfect.
English to worse English. Right.
Okay, two questions. First about the KGB. Yeah, I just didn't mention it in a fit of absent-mindedness, or maybe I just assumed everyone is sort of starting from that frame of reference. But you're right, it is an important part of his biography, and I think even more salient, it's an important part of the biography of a lot of people very close to him who he has relied on for advice and support throughout the years, including the current head of its successor organization, the FSB, a guy named Bortnikov, who like Putin, is from Leningrad and joined the KGB in the mid-1970s. The head of the Security Council, a guy named Patrushev, who, like Putin, is from Leningrad and joined the KGB in the mid-1970s. Like the guy who's in charge of one of the biggest industrial conglomerates, a guy named Chemezov that runs the defense industrial sector. Putin worked with him in the KGB in East Germany. And we could go on and on and on. And I'm going to allow myself an anecdote from the early 2000s. This is not my anecdote. It's a joke that appears in a book. But it speaks to the point of loyalty and like-mindedness. So a guy's on a tram in Moscow in 2002, and he turns to the person next to him and says, do you work for the FSB, the Federal Security Service? And the person says, no. He said, are you from St. Petersburg? And the person says, no. He says, do you work at the Kremlin? The person says, no. He says, all right, then get off my foot, right? So he wanted to find out who he's dealing with, right? Before. So yes, I think it's not just Putin. That's why I think of it Team Putin, and it is an important part of the story that I sort of left out. On the second part, world order, I think you're exactly right that it's not just that Russia disagrees with what people refer to as the liberal international order. It's that they think the Americans and the West Europeans don't believe any of that nonsense either, and it's just all rhetoric. And if you look at the way they behave like other great powers, and we just want to be given the same rights as these great powers. And I must say, and you're right, and the Russians are right to point to American hypocrisy on a lot of these things, like the war in Iraq, for example. I think that was a big mistake for a whole bunch of reasons, including what it says about how the US thinks the international order should work. So I'm willing to buy that part of the story, but I guess I'm still enough of a small L liberal that I think it's not total nonsense to say that after World War II, there was a decision made to create an international system in which borders could not be changed by force, in which trade should be free, and that this would help create a world that is more stable, not only for the great powers, but for smaller powers who also have a say in the international system. So I don't agree with giving Russia a sphere of influence in its former satellite countries, and I actually don't believe in the Monroe Doctrine that the US should tell other countries they can't be involved in Latin America. I think if we're going to be fair about this, then small powers in all parts of the world should have some say in determining their future. That doesn't mean I'm a huge fan of NATO expansion. I think it was mismanaged. I think it was especially mismanaged in 2008 when it was said that Georgia and Ukraine would be able to join, and that it was both unnecessary and a mistake, right? So I had my quarrels with US foreign policy, but I think at heart, most Western foreign policy elites believe to a certain extent in creating a different order than a dog-eat-dog 19th century diplomacy world, and that the Russian elite around Putin does not believe in that order and thinks it's all hypocrisy. I think it's only part hypocrisy, but some of it's sincere. So.
All right, so I'm going to turn to a policymaker, an implementer. Brett, you had a question? Yep, so please introduce yourself.
Thanks. I'm Brett McGurk, lecturer here at CSAC. I was in the Obama administration and the Trump administration, did the Russia channel on Syria for almost 3 years. And so Mike and I talked a little bit about this. I'm just curious how you assess Putin's intervention in Syria, which was an extraordinary event. Mm-hmm. And I was struck by your Yalta example, because the Russians presented it as, hey, you want to figure out Syria? U.S. and Russia have to get together as great powers and figure this out. Mm-hmm. I did not see it necessarily as they believed they necessarily had to intervene to save Assad. That was part of it. it was much bigger to them in terms of what they wanted to get out of it, and it's been hugely successful, I think, from their vantage point. But I'm just curious, given that this is also in the news, just how you assess that pretty dramatic move, this very expeditionary military mission in the Middle East, and what was Putin's driving motivation, and kind of how you see it playing out.
Okay, so the question was from Brett McGurk, who is, he said very modestly, a lecturer here, but he's actually are you the Leopold Fellow this year? The Payne lecturer, right. We have a few endowed lectureships, and so Brett is the Payne lecturer. He also worked first in the Obama administration and then in the Trump administration as really the main Sherpa on Syria policy, and actually in country a lot, in Syria in particular, helping our former Kurdish allies. His question was, can Brian give an assessment of Putin's intervention in Syria, which was really quite extraordinary? And the Yalta example was intriguing that you provided in terms of the way Putin sees the world. And I think I'm accurately conveying what Brett said in noting that for the Russians, the intervention seemed to be something bigger than just saving Assad.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I hope you're the PAYNE lecturer, not the PAIN lecturer.
Yes,
and,
yes,
yeah, okay.
PAYNE, sorry, yes.
Who would sign up for a class with the Payne lecturer? I guess some students might. Anyway, to get to your question. So at the beginning, I sketched out this, what I would call a Weberian way of thinking about motives. And I mentioned rational self-interest. And I think there is a strong element of that in the Syria intervention. So we can start the discussion with why this was sort of a rational step from Russian point of view to promote its interests and power in the world. They felt that their most reliable ally in the region was in danger of falling, and they wanted to shore him up. They had military facilities in Syria that they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose. They wanted to communicate to other potential states in the region that Russia was a reliable partner. So I think all of those things can be seen as part of the story. I also think it was an attempt to break out of what Russia perceived accurately, in some sense, as an attempt to isolate Russia after the events of Ukraine, and put themselves back in a position where they had to be talked to as one of the important powers. So that's still pretty much a standard kind of realist interpretation. The thing I think that is also part of the story that explains part of it is this thing I referred to about their sense that the United States is going around the globe promoting colored revolutions in places to undermine Russian interests. So they said that about Georgia in 2003, in Ukraine both in 2004 and 2014. They said it in other places around the world, and they said it about the Arab Spring. And I don't think they just said it, I think they meant it. And I think that they thought that the United States and the position it was taking with respect to Libya and some other countries was an attempt to weaken Russia's position in the world, and that should not be allowed to stand. So it also was about fighting this, the Russians sometimes refer to it as the Orange Plague after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, this attempt to foment revolutions in various places. And the Arab Spring was not separate from that, it was part of that. And it was just one more example of Obama's perfidy in terms of his approach to Russia and Russia's allies and Russia's interests. I think that's how they interpreted it. I don't think that's true, by the way. I guess I should say, just to finish the point, I think the U.S. was as much as surprised by the Arab Spring as everyone else. But I think that interpretation also weighed on the Syria decision.
Okay, I have a question from Martin Hellman, and then I am going to gracefully as possible, I don't know if I'll be doing it graciously, hand over the microphone to you to finish fielding questions as I go off and teach the hordes. Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
Martin Hellman, CSAC in electrical engineering. You made a good case that Russia punches above its weight. To what extent would you say the United States has been punching above its weight, and to what extent do you think the Russian punching above its weight is a reaction to that?
Okay, so again, I will translate. The question is, you mentioned Russia punching above its weight. To what extent is the United States punching above its weight? And may I editorialize punching below its weight? And that's the question.
Yeah,
basically.
okay.
Okay.
I guess first we have to define our time frame here. Are we talking about the United States from into the Cold Wars or 1991 forward, or are we talking about the last couple of years? So if we think about the period since the end of the Cold War, I think if I can quote Stalin in a different context, the United States was maybe a bit dizzy with success after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and perhaps an overambitious sense that, as Frank Fukuyama put it, who I know is also at Stanford, it was the end of history and liberal democracy had won out, and therefore a new world order could be built on those principles that wouldn't involve any of these great power politics, and we would all agree that we were moving forward to this common future for humanity. And that kind of feeling, I don't even think it was an intellectual position, I think it was more a sense of people at the time. The sense of optimism and boundlessness maybe led the United States into some mistakes, including Iraq, that ultimately has weakened the US in terms of its standing internationally and in terms of its power. Is the US, so I don't know if that's punching above its weight, but it was perhaps a sense of ambition that should have been more limited and should have been a bit more circumspect since 1991. More recently, obviously we have a US president who has a very different view of the international system and US power in this system, and he seems to, in some sense, agree with Putin that all of international politics is just cynicism and deal making, and there aren't any rules and there aren't any values. It's all about the great powers and their relations, and we don't care about the Ukraines of the world, and we don't care about the Kurds, and what matters is, you know, protecting our interests in that kind of very narrow, material, perhaps kind of cynical way. Whether the U.S. punches above its weight or below, I mean, I think it's still safe to say that as 20% of the world economy and the world's largest military, we have a lot of weight, and it's been part of U.S. foreign policy to try and advance those interests overseas.
How's it worked?
Has it worked? I think, yeah, okay, so if that's the question, I would say more no than yes. I think a bit more circumspection and a bit more restraint in various corners probably would have served the U.S. interest better long-term in terms of marshaling its resources, both for internal needs and for U.S. power in the world over the medium term. So.
All right, thank you. Substitute translator here. We have actually received an online question. We're very high tech here. So this is from Marek von Rennenkampf. Apologies, I only speak Russian and English. Putin lashed out in Crimea when Ukraine was lost to the EU. Given Russia's dwindling roster of allies around the world, how would Putin have responded if Assad's Syria had been lost? So similar to previous questions, but slightly different spin.
Right, so this is a hypothetical. Assume Assad went the way of Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president. What would Russia have done in that scenario? They would have been in a pickle, which is, I think, sorry?
Yanukovych.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Thank you very much. That was a bad mistake. Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president until February 2014, not Poroshenko, who was his successor. I think they would have been in a pickle, which is why they went earlier, because in the case of Crimea, they had forces there already, and it was fairly straightforward to move additional forces there after the Yanukovych government fell in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do if Assad had fallen. And so the Russians, together with the Iranians, decided that they needed to combine some Iranian troops with Russian air power to prevent the fall of Assad, which they were worried might happen at some point in that time frame. So I guess my answer to the counterfactual is if Assad had fallen, they would have had to try and rely on forces that they weren't able to marshal themselves, because although Russia could sustain a heavy tempo of air operations, a larger ground deployment would have been extremely difficult. So in that sense, I think it would have been too late.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, in back.
I'm Stephen Van, I'm an alum of the business school there at Stanford. The the various elements you've mentioned that compose the code or mentality, could you say how well formed you think these were in the minds of Putin and his cohort in the first term, let's say 2004? And to give that a really precise focus, do you think the West missed an opportunity in that period to bring Russia itself into NATO or not?
All right, so trying my hand at English to English. So from Stephen Banham, how well formed was this code or mentality for Putin and his team or his cohort in his first term in particular? And did the West miss an opportunity to bring Russia into the fold of NATO?
Okay, that's a great question. I argue in the book that the code really only crystallized at the end of his first term, the beginning of his second term, around 2003, 2004. I think initially Vladimir Putin was both somewhat uncertain about himself as a president and Russia's role in the world, and was influenced by various advisors who in some ways wanted to continue the Russian policy, and he saw 2001 and 9/11 as an opportunity to reach some kind of agreement with the United States about the future of the international order and using it to fight against terrorism. But he was disappointed by what he saw from the Bush administration after that, not only because of Iraq, but also the belief, and I think this is fairly well documented, that Putin believed that the U.S. Played a role in the events of Georgia and Ukraine in 2003, 2004, and there was civil society assistance there, right? Mike McFaul and others have written about this, but that doesn't mean the U.S. was pulling every string. And even if we look back to the events of Beslan in September 2004, when terrorists took a school in a republic in the southern region of Russia, his initial speech after the Beslan tragedy, when over 300 people were killed, half of them then children, was to attack the United States. He didn't do it by name, but he said, they are trying to tear a juicy morsel away from us, and we were weak, and the weak get beaten. And I don't know if this was conscious or not, but there's a famous Stalin quote from 1929, I believe, Amir can correct me if I'm wrong, in which he said, if we look at Russian history, when Russia was weak, the weak get beaten. And he felt, I think he became convinced because of a series of episodes in that time frame that the U.S. was not going to treat fairly with Russia. And that is when we see this sort of code crystallize in some ways. Now, did the West miss an opportunity to bring Russia into NATO? I don't think so, because simply Russia did not meet the criteria for NATO membership at that time frame. So even if you're a proponent of NATO expansion as a policy, Russia would not have met the criteria to get on the road to it. Now, there were people arguing in the Bush administration that the U.S. should signal more explicitly than it has that that path is there. But I think it was communicated to Russia in various ways that that path in some ways was there. But I'm also kind of cynical about how much that was meant, because Russia as a member of NATO would totally change the nature of NATO. And in particular, some kind of mutual treaty assurance to come to the defense of the other with Russia for the United States and West European countries immediately puts those countries in a position that if a military dispute erupts between Russia and China, for example, the US and the Western powers with Russia as a NATO member are immediately on Russia's side. I think Russia was ultimately just too large and too complicated to seriously be considered for membership, and it also didn't meet the internal criteria in terms of democracy, civilian control of the military in the ways that NATO defines it, in those sorts of things. So I think that was always a problem, which was a bigger problem with NATO expansion in the first place. Once it starts, what's the limit? And no one, I don't think, has ever come up with a good answer for the so-called in-between countries, Georgia, that various times have sought NATO membership, but doing so would clearly be an even bigger thumb in the eye than bringing in countries like Poland or even the Baltic states. So in that sense, moving forward with NATO expansion at the time it was moved forward with immediately raised that prospect and put us on this collision course. I think there should have been a way found to pursue the so-called Partnership for Peace, where there was more room for participation without membership taking place so early for the countries of Eastern Europe. Now, that's a difficult decision because as things turned out, those countries feel like they need that protection. But I don't think Russia was ever really in the cards as a member, despite rhetoric on both sides about that.
Amir, you had another question? Shall we?
I asked before, so.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Is he aware that he's punching above his weight? Because you study him very closely, but is he bluffing? He knows that he's bluffing, or is he already in the mode of overcompensating?
Mm-hmm.
So to repeat, is Putin aware that he's punching above his weight? Is this a bluff, or is there something more to it than that?
This is a really interesting question. I think in some sense he probably is, but I think he feels compelled to, as he defines Russia's interest in the world, and as he understands the international system, he feels compelled to pursue the policy he does, right? He wants to be the bear in the taiga, maybe not eating honeys and berries, but marshaling resources for internal needs. And they made a conscious decision after 2008 in the Georgia war to shift resources that they had said were going to go to education and healthcare and human capital and infrastructure, and put that money in military industrial and rearming the military. They could have made a different choice then. They did not make that choice. And I think he sort of feels like Russia has to do that given the resources that are available to it. But on another level, he's smart enough to understand that if they don't do something about the economy long term, Russia's position is going to continue to slip. But he also knows that the type of reforms that are required internally to make that possible would weaken his position, and therefore he temporizes and tries to get by with half measures and doesn't end up succeeding in those goals. So
There's someone in back. Yes. No, back. Yes, you.
Michael Gurditch, just not to overly simplify the problem that so-called hot peace, but what do you think that the solution to that would be from the U.S. perspective, and what the United States should really do about it, whether they really want to pull it down?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks. So from Michael Gurevich, can you solve American policy towards Russia for us? Paraphrasing.
The question put that way, the answer is clearly no, but let me say a few things about it. One of the implications, I think, of my argument, and it's an implication I don't really like, but I think an implication is US-Russian relations are not going to get that much better as long as Team Putin's in power. I think that given the mentality that guides the leadership in the Kremlin, it's hard to see some kind of broader-based accommodation with Russia that some people imagine we might be able to pursue after the end of the Cold War. And now, what does that mean? It means patience, but I think it also means probably a more transactional kind of relationship in the short term, just to deal with the issues that we have to deal with Russia on, and that are in our interest to deal with them on also. First on that list is arms control. I think the position we're in with arms control now is quite worrying, and I wish we had a US administration that had worked harder to save the INF Treaty and worked harder to save the Open Skies Treaty and was working harder now to save the New START Treaty. I really don't relish the position we'll be in 2 years of having no major nuclear arms control agreement between Russia and the United States. I think that's a mistake. So I think we should try and save New START and extend it in some way while negotiations go on some kind of successor. But that's a kind of limited thing. I also think we should, to the extent that we're able to, under the restrictions put on the United States, try and engage with Russian society in non-political spheres, because those are the only spheres we're allowed to engage with Russia on these days. But in the educational sphere, in the cultural sphere, in the sphere of sports, not that this is going to fix the relationship, because it's not, but simply to try and create a broader constituency in the US and in Russia for better relations at some point in the future. And then there are a series of other areas where some transactional work with Russia is clearly necessary, but I think some kind of grand reset, as the phrase was from the Obama administration, is out of the cards as long as Vladimir Putin is the president or leader of Russia.
All right, and time for one final question. Yes.
Well, I was wondering how the wealth inequality, how it compares to the U.S. And it doesn't seem like Russia is very socialist. And also, how is Gorbachev regarded now?
Okay. Oh, you have to repeat.
Speak a bit about wealth inequality in Russia today, as well as how Gorbachev is considered in Russian society.
Okay. So on the first question, just as an academic, I want to distinguish between income inequality and wealth inequality. Income inequality is easier to measure than wealth inequality. In terms of income inequality, Russia has very high income inequality. And by very high, I mean about the level of the United States, which also has very high income inequality compared to other wealthy, advanced capitalist industrial democracies. So if you look at the US compared to our European partners or Japan, for example, we have much higher levels of income inequality now than those countries have. And Russia is kind of in about the same place. If we look at wealth inequality, it's a bit harder to say because it's hard to identify assets. But the most recent report from Credit Suisse, a Swiss bank that tries to estimate this, says Russia has the highest level of wealth inequality in the world of any major country. And U.S. has very high wealth inequality as well as income inequality. In Russia, it seems to be even higher, but it's really hard to value assets that people are trying to hide. So I don't think we know for sure, but we know it's very high. And we know that a lot of people who have enriched themselves in Russia in the last 20 years are people who are personally close to Vladimir Putin. That's simply a fact. The second part of the question, I've already forgotten. So you can— Gorbachev. How is Gorbachev thought of? Polling data shows Gorbachev's not that popular. He has been unpopular in Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed. He tried to run for president and I think got less than 1% of the vote in 1996, if I recall correctly. And public opinion poll shows he's not that popular still today. He is not conceived of as the person who brought freedom to the Soviet Union and Russia. He's conceived of as the person who brought economic hardship to average Russians.
I just wanted to ask, I mean, they fought the revolution for socialism, and it doesn't seem like it's just totalitarian. I mean, do they have, is it as socialist as Scandinavia? I mean, do they get a lot of—
Do you want to?
Sure, if you want to comment on the legacy of socialism in contemporary Russia.
Yes, Russia today is not a socialist country. It does not define itself as a socialist country. They have a free market system that operates dysfunctionally in some ways, but it is a market-based system. The one thing I will say is the state plays a bigger role in the economy now than it did in the 1990s and that it does in most Western capitalist countries. If we look at the major parts of the economy, whether it's transportation, oil and gas, other parts of the natural resource sector, it's a very state-dominated sector of the economy, but it's certainly in no way socialist. I mean, at this point, we probably shouldn't get into a long discussion of what we mean by the term socialism, but if we look at their social welfare system, it's been fairly poorly funded for quite a long time. And if we look at how much they spend on healthcare education compared to the United States or other Western countries, it's actually below that as a percentage of the economy.
All right, thank you. Please join me in thanking Brian Taylor.